30%. That's the floor. For every single week since February the 8th, at least 30 cents of every dollar's worth of tokens that American developers pushed through OpenRouter went to a Chinese model. Some weeks it touched 46%. A year ago, that number was 11. In the first half of last year, it was 4.5. So the headline writes itself. China is eating America's AI lunch. I've read about a dozen versions of that take this week, and almost every one of them is wrong about why. So I'm going to walk you through what actually happened here, because the mechanism matters a lot more than the flag printed on the model card. This is not a story about national pride. It's a story about arithmetic and about what happens to a business when the thing it sells stops being scarce. Let me give you the actual numbers before anyone spins them into something they're not. The measurement everyone is quoting this week comes from OpenRouter, and you need to understand what OpenRouter is because it changes how you read the stat. It's a routing marketplace, a middleman that sits between developers and dozens of models, and it forwards each request wherever the developer points it. On that platform, the share of tokens flowing to Chinese open models, and I mean DeepSeek, Alibaba's Quen family, Z.AI's GLM line, Moonshot's Kimi, has held above 30% every single week since early February, peaking somewhere near 46. CNBC put real names on it. Lindy, an AI agent startup, moved 100% of its traffic off Claude and onto DeepSeek and says the switch will save it millions. On Versal, the newer GLM 5.2 saw its daily token volume grow 27-fold in its first week. Those are not rounding errors. Something real is moving, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't. Here is the single number that explains almost everything you just heard. Price. The open Chinese models run somewhere between 60 and 90% cheaper than the frontier American ones. One direct comparison put Chinese models at roughly 18 cents per million tokens, against about $4 per million for comparable American output. Sit with that for a second. That is not a 10% discount you haggle over in a procurement meeting. That is more than a 20-to-1 gap. And when a price difference gets that large, it stops being a preference and it becomes a forcing function. Any engineering lead who is paying $4 for something they can buy for 18 cents at genuinely comparable quality and does nothing about it is not being loyal to a vendor. They are being negligent with the company's money. That's the honest framing. Nobody switched because they love a particular country. They switched because the spreadsheet stopped being ambiguous. But wait, are these models actually any good? Because a discount on garbage is not a discount, it's a trap. And this is the part that should genuinely bother the American labs more than the price does. For a lot of ordinary work, yes, they are good enough. The capability gap between the absolute frontier and the best open models has been compressing for 2 years straight. On the routine tasks that make up the overwhelming bulk of real production traffic, summarizing, classifying, extracting structured data, drafting boilerplate, simple code completion, the difference between the very best model and a solid open Chinese one is often invisible to the end user. It is not invisible on the hardest reasoning problems. It's very visible there. But most requests in a real product are not the hardest reasoning problem. They're mundane. And on mundane, good enough and 20 times cheaper beats slightly better and 20 times the price every day of the week. That's not ideology. That's just how buyers behave when quality converges and price doesn't. Now here's where the hype crowd loses me completely. Tokens are not the metric that matters. A token is not a dollar, and it is definitely not a customer. OpenRouter is one marketplace, and it's popular specifically with indie developers and small startups precisely because it makes model shopping frictionless. It is not where a bank or a hospital network or a Fortune 500 with a compliance department runs its regulated workloads. So when you see 46% of tokens, what you are actually measuring is the behavior of the single most price-sensitive, least locked-in slice of the entire market. These are the people who were always going to chase the cheapest good enough option the instant it appeared. Measuring raw token count and then calling it market share is like measuring a highway by counting the bicycles on it. It's real, it's informative, and it is absolutely not the same thing as who owns the road. Anybody handing you that 46% number as proof that America lost is either not thinking carefully or is selling you something. The engineering reality underneath all of this is routing. and it genuinely deserves some respect because it's clever. Modern AI products do not send every request to one giant God model anymore. That's amateur hour and it's expensive. They classify the task first. Is this a hard, multi-step reasoning problem? Or is it reformat this block of JSON and summarize this support email? The hard stuff, maybe 10 or 20% of calls, still goes to the frontier model because it has to. The boring majority gets routed to the cheapest model that clears the quality bar. And here's the genuinely uncomfortable truth for the frontier labs. The boring majority is most of the volume. So a single company can move 80% of its tokens onto a Chinese model / its inference bill and still quietly depend on an American frontier model for the 20% that actually defines whether the product works. The token chart screams collapse. The revenue and the hard problem dependency underneath it tell a far calmer story. Now the part nobody wants to say out loud because it cuts against the cheerleading on both sides. There are real reasons to be careful here, and they are not the ones cable news picks. 1. Governance. Routing your prompts, which often contain your customer's personal data, your proprietary source code, your internal strategy, to a model whose hosting and data handling you have never actually audited, is a compliance problem no matter what country the weights came from. 2. Dependency risk. There are already reports that Beijing is weighing whether to restrict some of these models as American reliance on them grows. Read that again. The cheap tap you just built your margins on is a tap that somebody else controls. Building your entire unit economics on a supplier that a foreign government could throttle with a policy memo is exactly the kind of concentration risk a serious engineering organization is supposed to design against. Cheap is not the same as safe, and open weights only fixes the dependency problem if you are actually self-hosting them, which most of these OpenRouter users are emphatically not. So here is my verdict. The China overtook the US in AI headline is overstated, and that token share statistic is being asked to carry a lot of weight it simply cannot hold. Tokens are not revenue. OpenRouter is not the whole market. And most of these companies still reach straight for a frontier model the moment the problem gets genuinely hard. That part is hype, and you should discount it hard. But, and I do not say this lightly, the signal underneath the noise is real, and it is serious, just not in the way the headline wants you to believe. What this data actually proves is that inference for routine work has become a commodity. Switching costs have collapsed to almost nothing, and the frontier labs have lost their pricing power on the easy 80% of what they do. That is a margin story, not a flag story. The Chinese labs did not win the AI race. What they did was commoditize the cheap seats, and for a business model built on charging premium prices for every seat in the house, that is quietly the more dangerous outcome. If I'm running pricing at a frontier lab this quarter, I am not lying awake about patriotism. I'm lying awake about arithmetic. If this breakdown saved you from a lazy headline, do me a favor and subscribe, because I do one of these every single day, and I care a lot more about the mechanism than the panic. Drop a comment telling me what you're routing where and what actually held up once it hit production, because that's the real data. I read them. I'll see you in the next one.